So when we think about security, right, probably come as no surprise to anybody in this conversation. But if you talk to folks that are out there in high ranking IT positions, and I saw we have a lot of those in today's call, right? A lot of directors of IT. We have a few CIOs, a few CISOs, and kind of the rest of the gamut there. But when you talk to folks in those positions, really regardless of what vertical they're in, everyone out there tells you that security is a top priority for their organization, if not the top priority. So, regardless of the industry that you're in, right, you can see here 65% of higher education say security is their top priority, 57% of banking identified security as their top priority, and 88% of overall leaders believe that data security will become an even higher priority going into and through 2025. So, not really surprising, right? As much as we hear AI these days, right, all day, every day, again, kind of regardless of vertical, regardless of industry, security is outpacing even artificial intelligence in terms of both prioritization and spending, right? Folks are committing to making their security more fulsome, making an overall better approach to cybersecurity. And in conjunction with that, right, if you look at the big industry aggregators like Gartner, you can see a massive spending increase that's happening in accordance with this, right? So security spending up 15.5% between 2024 and 2025. And that's not even accounting for the spending increase that we've seen in the industry over the last 2, 3, 4 years, right? So most organizations, IT spending is tending to go down, right? IT departments are constantly being asked to do more with less. We're seeing, budget decrease, again, pretty much regardless of vertical. But despite that overall decrease, there are two key areas where we see that expense continuing to either stay flat or in most cases actually increase. Number one of those is cybersecurity, and the second is CX. And a lot of CX or customer experience is also rolling AI initiatives into that. So you would think, right, if we've established successfully that more organizations than ever are saying that security is their top priority, and more organizations than ever are spending more money than ever on making sure that cybersecurity is their top priority, we must be the safest we've ever been as an industry, right? Well, again, probably not surprising. That doesn't seem to really be the case here either, right? You can't turn on the nightly news these days. You can't go to Google or whatever your news aggregator of choice is without seeing a variety of cybersecurity attacks, right? Phishing attacks, ransomware attacks, crypto locker. And these things are hitting, again, retail providers, local governments, county, municipal, healthcare providers. So organizations where you would expect them to have a layer of defense, a layer of protection that would be sufficient to the task at hand. So despite all of these companies that are out there saying that security is their top priority, despite all of the money that we're throwing at this problem, this continues to happen. So to me, that begs the question, why, right? If we've established that security is our priority and we've established that, seemingly money is no object when it comes to locking our environments down, why are we seeing breaches happening at a higher and more alarming rate than ever? And to me, it really comes down to kind of two key things, right? So first and foremost, to be totally fair, attacks in general are up, right? There are more folks out there committing these acts, more folks that are bad actors that are looking to take advantage of cybersecurity issues, looking to take advantage of organizations by breaching, by crypto lockering, by phishing, by getting, compromising accounts. So the volume of attacks itself has just increased. But I think another part of the problem, and one that we as an industry don't really lean into too often, is I think we have not necessarily done a great job of identifying the issue, right? When we have companies that are saying that security is their top priority, this might be a little bit of a hot take statement, right? But I would contend that that's not necessarily true. I would say that those organizations, very many of them who say security is their top priority, if we actually did an audit with them, if we actually dug in deep and and embedded ourselves into their IT department, into their day-to-day operations, I bet in many cases we would find that security is not actually their top priority. So if security isn't their top priority, what is, right? Why do we think that we're prioritizing security when we're not? And to me, I think the more realistic way of approaching this is looking at it to say security alone isn't our top priority. It can't be. Because if it were, The easiest way for us to all become secure would be to walk into your data center, right? Unplug all of the network cables from all of your systems, disconnect the power from every server, every device, and congratulations, you're now secure. You're unreachable, right? Your data cannot be accessed remotely. It can't be accessed by a bad actor, but it also can't be accessed by anyone else. So if you were to take those measures, yeah, you might be secure, but now your productivity, your ability to actually perform work, your ability to accomplish anything of note of record, is gone. So to me, I think that misidentification is that security alone isn't our top priority. Our top priority is actually the blending, right? The marriage of both security and productivity together. And I think a failure to identify that as what our actual priority is has led us to having a number of the challenges that we see on a regular basis, right? With how compromisations are happening and how, despite all of the spending and all of the time and the effort, we're still seeing issues because we've just misidentified really where our priority lies. So once we do that, right, we have a tendency to then look at security in that archaic model as like this single monolithic structure, right? We see cybersecurity as a thing that you can attain, something that you might go out and look to try to buy off the shelf from a provider. And again, as an industry, sometimes we haven't done ourselves a lot of favors because there are folks that approach this as something that can be sold in that fashion too, right? Like you can just walk into a provider and buy the concept of security, and it doesn't really work that way, right? And we talk about like the marriage of security and productivity together, and I use that term very prescriptively, right? So why a marriage? Why is it the marriage of security to productivity? To me, it's just because, like any marriage, right, if it's going to work, it's going to require some form of compromise. Now, folks might hear that, right? You might think like, Kevin, how dare you imply that we would knowingly compromise our own security in any capacity, right? Whether that's in the name of productivity or not, we wouldn't do that, right? We would never take any form of an action as an organization, as a company, as a corporation that would put ourselves, our data, our users, or most importantly, our customers at risk. But I'd wager we're all doing this all the time already, right? So unfortunately, I can't ask for like a show of virtual hands here, but I'll just ask a couple hypothetical questions that I'd love for everybody to think about, right? And maybe there's something we can dive into a little bit in the panel, but how many of you out there of the 40 some folks that are on the webinar live right now, how many of you have remote workers? Right? How many of you embraced, especially since 2020, the concept of a hybrid workforce, whether that's for everyone all the time or for a select portion of your organization some of the time? How many of you leverage mobile devices, right? Whether those are laptops that leave the office or true handheld mobile devices and tablets. How many use SaaS applications, right? How many have taken the steps of saying, hey, we used to maintain this customer data, this ERP system, this CRM system, whatever it might be, in-house, but now we host that with a provider, right? And we trust that provider, we trust that vendor to ensure the integrity, the solvency, and the security of all of that data in that environment. Even cloud service providers, right? So in Evolve IP, how many of you out there? I know a lot of our current customers are on the call today. We have a few prospective ones as well, but even working with a cloud services provider, there's a level of risk that's involved there, right? We're taking some form of risk in the way that we're working on a day-to-day basis, right? Whether that's through a remote workforce or a hybrid workforce, we're allowing folks who are outside of an area that we control, potentially on devices to which we have limited control as well, especially for an organization that leverages bring your own device as part of your security. We're making those trade-offs in the name of productivity, right? We're making those trade-offs to make our users' lives easier, to enable them to have better access, to perform their job more succinctly, to better serve their customers, to better accomplish what it is that they need to do in order to do their work. So I think for us to take a more fulsome, a better approach to cybersecurity, if we think about it in those terms, we can then better quantify what that risk is. But like any problem, the first step towards solving is admitting that it exists, right? Admitting that even though many of us say security is our top priority, it really isn't, right? Security blended with productivity, blended with the ability for our folks to do the work that they are tasked with doing, is really the heart of what we're trying to accomplish. And once we do that, to me, then it becomes a much more attainable, much more digestible conversation, right? So I talk about cybersecurity as like a single monolithic structure, right? And what does that mean? Well, I don't know why I was thinking about Egypt at the time of putting this deck together, but the image that immediately popped into my head is, think of it as the difference between an obelisk and a pyramid, right? So an obelisk, if we think of security as a single unified thing, man, that just seems an insurmountable task, right? And there are a lot of organizations that have approached security that way historically, that, hey, you know what? If we're talking about how we can lock our organization down to become more secure, maybe we're going out there and looking at an EDR solution, right? An endpoint detection and response. But we're not going to buy an EDR solution because we also need multi-factor authentication. And we also need single sign-on. We also need to have compliance audits that are done. And we need to have a disaster recovery solution. And by the way, we should also have email filtering and address the way that we're doing that. So we bundle all of these things together and then look to try to solve that as a single problem. And I think that's not the correct way of approaching it, right? Because now we're taking a job that's already difficult. We're taking a task that's already challenging, and we're making it practically insurmountable, right? I love the old adage of, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? We have this elephant of cybersecurity need that's part of all of our organizations that we want to couple with the way that we're connecting our people to the stuff that they need to access in order to do the work that they need to do. And it would be great if we could break that down into some bite-sized chunks. And I think that's the pyramid approach, right? That's if we take this concept of defense in depth, right? And I'm sure many of you, hopefully all of you, have heard that term at some point within the last few years, defense in depth. The concept of defense in depth is that even if you find yourself in a situation where some form of your approach to security is compromised, right? Something gets past your spam filter. There are other systems in place that all work in conjunction with one another to mitigate that compromisation, right? So if something gets past your spam filter, ends up on an end user's computer, then you have an EDR or MDR or antivirus solution that's running on that machine that, hey, you know what, throws up a flag, says, I see a malicious, code injection or some form of a virus or some form of malware, spyware that got through our security measures and lives on this device. We're going to now isolate that, allow folks to get it and remediate it and do work to fix the problem. We can then take that several steps further, right? So what happens if something gets past your spam filter and gets past your EDR, MDR, XDR, antivirus solution, right? Now we have the ability to lock that down at the server level. We have the ability to have true data survivability through backup, right? Recoverability through disaster recovery replication. So all these different blocks represent different parts of what might be a hypothetical defense in depth strategy for a customer. And the nice thing here is if you're an organization that's thinking you either want to reevaluate what you're doing from a security perspective already, or maybe you feel like you're lagging behind a little bit and it's time to really kind of roll up your sleeves and get into this security conversation and discovery for yourselves, breaking these things down into their individual building blocks makes it so that you can take a really nice approach to not having to eat that whole elephant in one bite, right? So how you can break this down into a more approachable and digestible measure. If we had to focus on solely two things out of this entire pyramid structure here, and there are certainly more blocks that can get added to this, but I'd say the two most important, or the two best starting points if you're looking for inroads into these conversations: ensuring that your organization has some form of multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, or identity management solution, right? So why MFA? Well, one of the big attack vectors that's out there right now is just through compromised credentials, right? And I know this is something that we'll definitely dive into a little bit more in the panel, so I don't want to get too far afield into the conversation, but there are a lot of compromised credentials that are floating out there that you can basically just go buy at a virtual flea market out on the dark web, right? You can get, a username that I used to personally have 3 years ago on LinkedIn, and a password that was picked up somewhere in an account compromisation from a different supplier, at a different point in time. And then the bad actors, right, they'll sit there and take all those combinations of usernames with all those combinations of passwords and then do what they call a credential stuffing attack and put those two things together and just start hammering every single possible system that they can think to try to log into with those two things. Multi-factor authentication helps organizations have a 99.2% reduction of risk of those types of attacks, right? So it can help in over 99% of cases where an account would be compromised because the username and or the password have somehow gotten out there into the open. just by simply having some form of MFA solution, right? So whether that's something like Duo, which is part of the Evolve IP offering, Google Authenticator, Microsoft has their own MFA solution that's built into their 365 platform. So short version of that is if you're not doing MFA already, definitely start there and ensure that you have some form of multi-factor authentication. And to our earlier point, if you don't have MFA already, I would almost guarantee it's not because you don't see the value in it, but it's because your organization has probably historically pushed back because there would be a negative impact to there would be a perceived negative impact to your user experience, right? Well, we don't want to do multi-factor authentication because it's hard. It makes the user's login process longer. Users don't like it. They feel like they have to jump through a lot of hoops to get to the things that they need to in order to do their work. So again, that's that marriage of security and productivity. So if you can find ways to implement a multi-factor authentication solution that is not to the detriment of your user experience, so doing something like a consolidated approach to end user computing with DAS, desktop as a service, that makes it a lot easier to integrate those types of security apparatus, those types of security additions into the way your folks work today. So that's one of the two kind of base level points in the pyramid here. And the other for me is really the combination of disaster recovery and data survivability. So once again, if you as an organization are not doing DR replication and don't have some form of an externally hosted immutable, so unchangeable backup, that's also a great entry place into ensuring the integrity and security of your environment. Now, some folks out there might be scratching their head a little bit and thinking, well, Kevin, like, what the heck does disaster recovery have to do with security? Like, that's to protect me from acts of God if there's a fire, flood, earthquake, data center outage, long-term power outage. And all those things are true, but that's a little bit of an archaic look at the way disaster recovery works today, right? We really want to think about these as an IT resilience or business continuity strategy at this point, where your disaster recovery and your backup is your get out of jail free card in the event that all else fails, right? If you have this full defense in depth strategy and somehow, through the sheer, audacity of the attack that you're facing as an organization, the bad actors somehow navigate through and get past your spam filter. They get past your EDR solution. They get past, all of your 0-day vulnerability protections that you have in place and somehow exploit your system, somehow still have, a critical vulnerability that they're able to take advantage of. That ability to recover and restore your environment really is the ultimate form of protection, right? That's in case all else fails, in case of emergency break glass, that recoverability is your peace of mind to ensure that regardless of whatever other security measures you have in place, if they are breached, if they are invalidated, if they are bypassed in some form, you still have the ability to get all of your data, your applications, and the rest of your environment back online in a quick manner. The last thing I'll touch on here with the pyramid is if you look at that bottom level, you'll see a lot of policy in there, right? So compliance policies, security policies, business continuity policies, incident response planning, and data governance. It's really important that we make sure we're factoring all of these things into our security planning as well, because it isn't enough for us to just have the technology in place to ensure the security integrity of our environment and to hopefully try to embrace that gap between security and productivity. We also need to make sure that all of these things are auditable. All of them are happening with some form of company oversight that commits itself to an ongoing reevaluation of these processes, right? If you're an organization that's already facing compliance standards, whether those are things like FINRA, FERPA, FFIEC, High Trust, HIPAA, SOC 2, NIST 800, 171, ISO 27001, if you're already dealing with compliance, and this is a process that you're probably already familiar with, right? You're going through these annual, in some cases, more than once a year audits that are evaluating not just the controls you have in place, right? Not just the things that you're doing to protect your environment, but also auditing the policies that govern those controls too, and ensuring that you have the right levels of complexity that are in place for the sensitivity of the data that you're guarding. So if I could just make one last point here, again, if we can start to really shift our thinking in two ways. So instead of thinking of security as the top priority of our organization, if we can acknowledge that the marriage between security alongside productivity and the ability to effectively deliver on both of those is really where our organizational priorities need to be, I think that puts us in a position where we can now start to stop looking at cybersecurity as that single monolithic structure and break it all down into more digestible, easier to attain, easier to get started, and frankly, a whole heck of a lot less intimidating solution that all of our organizations can look to embrace.